Welcome to day 43 of reading for 30 minutes for the rest of my life. Tonight, we got a new one. The Fellowship of the Ring. Oh my god, I'm so excited to read this. I love fantasy books. I love fantasy. My favorite game of all time is Skyrim. So I think I'm really gonna enjoy this. So yeah, I'm ready to get started. I know this is probably gonna last a month straight, probably. This is gonna be a long read, so yeah, I'm excited. Let's get started. Let me get my phone here. Okay. Alrighty. 30 minutes starting now. As you can see. Let me clean the camera a little bit. Alright, here we go. Prologue. Concerning hobbits. This book is largely concerned with hobbits, and it's from pages a reader may discover much of their character and a little of their history. Further information will also be found in the selection from the Red Book of the Westmarch that has already been published, under the title of The Hobbit. That story was derived from the earlier chapters of the Red Book, composed by Bilbo himself, the first hobbit to become famous in the world at large, and called by him there and back again, since they told of his journey into the East and his return, an adventure which later involved all the hobbits and the great events of that age that are here related. Many, however, may wish to know more about this remarkable people from the outset, which some may not possess the earlier book. For such readers, a few notes on the more important points are here collected from Hobbit lore, and the first adventure is briefly recalled. Hobbits are an unobtrusive but very ancient people, more numerous formerly than they are today, for they love peace and quiet and good-tilled earth. A well-ordered and well-farmed countryside was their favorite haunt. They do not and did not understand or like machines more complicated than forge bellows, a watermill or hand-loom, though they were skillful with tools. Even in ancient days they were, as a rule, shy of the big folk, as they called us, and now they avoid us with dismay, and are becoming hard to find. They are quick of hearing and sharp-eyed, and though they are inclined to be fat and do not hurry unnecessarily, they are none the less nimble and deft in their movements. They possess from the first of the art of disappearing swiftly and silently, when large folk whom they do not wish to meet come blundering by, and this art they have developed until to men it may seem magical. But hobbits have never, in fact, studied magic of any kind, and their elusiveness is due solely to a professional skill that heredity and practice, and a close relationship with the earth have rendered imitable by bigger and clumsier races. For they are a little people, smaller than dwarves, less stout and stocky, that is, even when they are not actually much shorter. Their height is variable, ranging between 2 and 4 feet of our measure. They seldom now reach 3 feet, but they have dwindled, they say. And in ancient days they were taller. According to the Red Book, Bandabras took, Bolrorer, son of Isengrim II, was 4'5" and able to ride a horse. He surpassed in all Hobbit records only by 2 famous characters of old, but that curious matter is dealt with in this book. As far as the hobbits of the Shire, from whom these tales are concerned, in the days of their peace and prosperity, they were a merry folk. They dressed in bright colors, being notably fond of yellow and green, but they seldom wore shoes, since their feet had tough, leathery soles, and they were clad in a thick, curling hair, much like the hair of their heads, which was commonly brown. Thus the only craft little practised among them was shoemaking, but they had long and skilful fingers, and could make many other useful and comely things. Their faces were as a rule natured rather than beautiful, broad, bright-eyed, red-cheeked, with mouths apt to laughter, and eating and drinking, and laugh they did, and eat and drink, often and heartily, being fond of simple jests at a time, and of 6 meals a day, when they could get them. They were hospitable and delighted in parties, and in presents they gave away freely and eagerly accepted. It is plain indeed that in spite of later estrangement, hobbits are relatives of ours, far nearer to us than elves or even the dwarves. Of old they spoke the languages of men, after their own fashion, and liked and disliked much of the same things as men did. But what exactly our relationship is can no longer be discovered. The beginning of hobbits lies far back in the elder days that are now lost and forgotten. Only the elves still preserve any records that vanished time, and their traditions are concerned almost entirely with their own history, in which men appear seldom and hobbits are not mentioned at all. Yet it is clear that hobbits had, in fact, lived quietly in Middle-earth for many years long before other folk became even aware of them, and the world being after all full of strange creatures beyond count, these little people seemed of very little importance. But in the days of Bilbo and Frodo, his heir, they suddenly became, by no wish of their own, both important and renowned, and troubled the counsels of the wise and the great. Those days, the third age of Middle Earth, are now long past, and shape of all lands had been changed. But the regions in which hobbits then lived were doubtless the same as those in which they still linger, the northwest of the old world, east of the sea. Of their original home, the hobbits of Bilbo's time preserved no ledge. A love of learning, other than genealogical lore, was far from general among them, but there remained still a few in the older families who studied their own books, and even gathered reports of old times in distant lands from elves, dwarves, and men. Their own records began only after settlement of the Shire, and their most ancient legends hardly looked further back in their wandering days. It is clear, nonetheless, from these legends and from the evidence of their peculiar words of customs, that, like many other folk, hobbits had in the distant past moved westward. Their earliest tales seem to glimpse a time when they dwelt in the upper vales of Anduin, between the eaves of Greenwood and the great of the Misty Mountains. Why they later undertook the hard and perilous crossing of the mountains into Eriador is no longer certain. Their own accounts speak of the multiplying of men in the land, and of a shadow that fell on the forest, so that it became darkened, and its new name was Mirkwood. Before the crossing of the mountains, the hobbits had already become divided into three somewhat different breeds: Harfoots, Stores, and Fallhides. The Harfoots were browner of skin, smaller and shorter, and they were beardless and bootless. Their hands and feet were neat and nimble, and they preferred highlands and hillsides. The Stores were broader, heavier in build. Their feet and hands were larger, and they preferred flatlands and riversides. The Fallonides were fairer of skin and also of hair. They were taller and slimmer than the others. They were lovers of trees and of woodlands. The Harfoots had much to do with the dwarves in ancient times, and long lived in the foothills of the mountains. They moved westward early, and roamed over Eriador as far as Weathertop, while the others were still in Wilderland. They were the most normal and representative variety of hobbit, and far the most numerous. They were the most inclined to settle in one place, and the longest preserved their ancestral habit of living in tunnels and holes. The Stores lingered long by the banks of the great river Anduin, and were less shy of men. They came west after the Harfoots, and followed the course of the Loudwater southwards, and there were many of them long dwelt between Tharbad and the borders of Dunland before they moved north again. The Falahides, the least numerous, were a northerly branch. They were more friendly with the elves than the other hobbits were, and had more skill in language and song than in handicrafts, and in the old they preferred hunting to tilling. They crossed the mountains north of Rivendell, and came down the river Horwell and Eriador, and soon mingled with the other kinds that had preceded them. but being somewhat bolder and more adventurous, they were often found as leaders or chieftains among clans of Harefoots or Stoors. Even in Bilbo's time, the strong Hidish strain could still be noted among the greater families, such as the Tooks and the Masters of Buckland. In the westlands of Eriador, between the misty mountains and the mountains of Lune, the hobbits found both men and elves. Indeed, a remnant still dwelt there of the Dunedain, the Dunedain. Dunedain. I'm gonna research these words. Don't worry. The kings of men that came over the sea out of Westernis, but they were dwindling fast, and the lands of their north kingdom were falling far and wide in the waste. There was room and to spare for incomers, and ere long the hobbits began to settle in ordered communities. Most of their earlier settlements had long disappeared and had been forgotten in Bilbo's time. But one of the first to become important still endured. Though reduced in size, this was at Bree and in the Chetwood that lay around about some 40 miles east of the Shire. It was in these early days, doubtless, that the hobbits learned their letters and began to write after the manner of the Dunedain, who had, in their turn, long before learned the art from the elves. And in those days, also, they forgot whatever languages they had used before, and spoke ever after the common speech. The Westron, as it was named, that was current through all the lands of the kings, from Arnor to Gondor, and about all the coast of the sea, from Boffalas to Lune. Yet they kept a few words of their own, as well as their own names of months and days, and a great store of personal names out of the past. But this time legend among the hobbits first becomes history with a reckoning of years, for it was in the 1600 and first year of the third age that the Falahide brothers, Marcho and Blanco, set out from Bree, and having obtained permission from the High King at Fornost, they crossed the Brown River, Barunduin, with a great following of hobbits. They passed over the bridge of Stone Bros, and had been built in the days of the power of the North Kingdom, and they took all the land beyond to dwell in, between the river and the far downs. All that was demanded of them was that they should keep the great bridge in repair, and all the other bridges and roads, speed in king's messengers, and acknowledge his lordship. Thus began the Shire reckoning. For the year of the crossing of the Brandywine, as the hobbits turned the name, became 1 year of the Shire, and all later dates were reckoned from it. At once there, and soon passed once more out of the history of men. As the records of Gondor relate to this, Argibald II, the 20th of the northern line, which came to an end when Ardavi 300 years later. Thus, the years of the third age is the reckoning of the elves, and the Dunedain may be found by adding 1600 to the dates of Shire reckoning. At once the western hobbits fell in love with their new land, and they remained there, and soon passed once more out of the history of men and of elves. While they were still a king, they were in the name of his subjects, but they were, in fact, ruled by their own chieftains and meddled not at all with events in the world outside. To the last battle at Fornos with the Witch Lord of Angmar, they sent some bowmen to the aid of the king, or so they maintained, though no tales of men recorded. But in that war the North Kingdom ended, and then the hobbits took the land of their own, and they chose from their own chiefs a thane to hold the authority of the king that was gone. There was for 1,000 years they were little troubled by wars, and they prospered and multiplied after the dark plague, until the disaster of the long winter and the famine that followed it. Many thousands then perished, but the days of Dearth, 1158-60, were at the time of this tale long past, and the hobbits had again become accustomed to plenty. The land was rich and kindly, and though it had long been deserted when they entered it, it had before been well tilled, and there the king had once had farms, cornlands, vineyards, and woods. 40 leagues it stretched from the far downs to the Brandywine Bridge, and 50 from the northern moors to the marshes in the south. The hobbits named it the Shire, as the region of the authority of their thane, and a district of well-ordered business, and there, in that pleasant corner of the world, they plied their well-ordered business of living, and they healed less and less the world outside their dark things moved, until they became to think that peace and plenty were the rule in Middle Earth and the right of all sensible folk. They forgot or ignored what little they had ever known of the guardians, and of the labors of. Let me reread that. They forgot or ignored. Okay. The hobbits named it the Shire, as the region of the authority of their Thane, and a district of well-ordered business, and there, in that pleasant corner of the world, they plied their well-ordered business of living, and they headed less and less the world outside, where the dark things moved, until they became to think that peace and plenty were the rule in Middle Earth, and the right of all sensible folk. They forgot or ignored what little they had ever known of the guardians and the labors of those that made possible the long peace of the Shire. They were, in fact, sheltered, but they had ceased to remember it. At no time the hobbits of any kind been warlike, and they had never fought among themselves. In olden days they had, of course, been often obliged to fight to maintain themselves in a hard world. But in the Bilbo's time that was very ancient history. The last battle before the story opens, and indeed the only one that had ever been fought within the borders of the Shire, was beyond living memory. The Battle of Greenfields, S.R. 1147, in which Bandobras routed an invasion of orcs, even the weather and had grown milder, and the wolves that had once come ravening out of the north in bitter white winters were now only a grandfather's tale. So though there were still some store of weapons in the Shire, they were still used mostly as trophies, hanging above hearths on the wall or gathered into the museum at Michael Delving. The Mathen horse, it was called, for anything that hobbits had no immediate use for, but were unwilling to throw away, they called a Matham. Their dwellings were apt to become rather crowded with Mathams, and many of the presents that passed from hand to hand were of that sort. None the less, ease and peace had left this people still curiously tough. They were, if it came to it, difficult to daunt or to kill, and they were perhaps so unwearingly fond of good things, not least because they could, when put to it, do without them, and could survive rough handling by grief foe, or weather in a way that astonished those who did not know them well and looked no further than their bellies and their well-fed faces. Though slow to quarrel, and for sport killing nothing that lived, they were doughty at bay, and at need could still handle arms. They were shot well with the bow, for they were keen-eyed and sure at the mark. Not only with bows and arrows, if any hobbit stooped for a stone, it was well to get quickly under cover, as all trespassing beasts knew very well. They shot well with the bow, for they were knee-eyed and sure at the mark. Not only with the bows and arrows, if any hobbit stooped for a stone, it was well to get quickly under cover, as all trespassing beasts knew very well. All hobbits had originally lived in holes in the ground, or so they believed. In such dwellings they still felt most at home. But in the course of time they had been obliged to adopt other forms of abode. I don't know how to say that. Actually, in the Shire, in Bilbo days, it was, as rule, only the richest and the poorest hobbits that maintained the old custom. The poorest went on living in burrows of the most primitive kind, mere holes indeed, with only one window or none, while the well-to-do still constructed more luxurious versions of the simple diggings of old. But suitable sites for these large and ramifying tunnels, or smiles as they called them, were not everywhere to be found, and in the flats and low-lying districts the hobbits, as they multiplied, began to build above ground. Indeed, even in the hilly regions and older villages, such as Hobbiton or Tuckerborough, or in the chief township of the Shire, Michael Delving in the White Downs, there were now many houses of wood, brick, or stone. These were specially favored by millers, smiths, ropers, and cartwaits, and others of that sort. for even when they had holes to live in, hobbits had long been accustomed to build sheds and workshops. The habit of building farmhouses and barns was said to have begun among the inhabitants of the Marish down to the Brandywine. The hobbits of that quarter, the East Farthing, were rather large and heavy-legged, and they were dwarf boots in the muddy weather, but they were well known to be stores in the large part of their blood, as indeed was shown by the down that many grew on their chins. No Harfoot or Fallahide had any trace of a beard. Indeed, the folk of the Marish and the Buckland east of the river, which they had afterward occupied, came for the most part later into the Shire from the south away, and they still had many peculiar names and strange words not found elsewhere in the Shire. It is problematic that the craft of building, as many other crafts beside, was derived from Dunedain. Dunedain. I'm gonna figure out how to say that. Don't worry. But the hobbits may have learned it direct from the elves, the teachers of men in their youth. For the elves of the High Kindred had not yet forsaken Middle-earth, and they dwelt still at the time at the Grey Havens away to the west, and in other places within reach of the Shire. 3 elf towers of the immemorial age were still to be seen on the tower hills beyond the western marches. They shone far off in the moonlight. The tallest was the furthest away, standing alone upon a green mound. The hobbits of Westfarthing said that one could see the sea from the top of that tower, but no hobbit had ever been known to climb it. Indeed, few hobbits had ever seen or sailed upon the sea, and fewer still had ever returned to report it. Most hobbits regarded even rivers and small boats with deep misgivings, and not many of them could swim. And as the days of the Shire lengthened, they spoke less and less with the elves, and grew afraid of them, and distrustful of those that had dealings with them, and the sea became a word of fear among them, and a token of death, and they turned their faces away from the hills in the west. The craft of building may have come from elves or men, but the hobbits used it in their own fashion. They did not go in for towers. Their houses were usually long, low, and comfortable. The oldest kind were indeed no more than built imitations of smeals, thatched with dry grass or straw, or roofed with tarves, or having walls somewhat bulged. That stage, however, belonged to the early days of the Shire, and hobbit building had long since been altered, improved by devices learned from dwarves or discovered by themselves. A preference for round windows and even round doors was the chief remaining peculiarity of the hobbit architecture. The houses in the holes of Shire hobbits were often large and inhabited by large families. Bilbo and Frodo Baggins were also the bachelors, very exceptional, as they were also in many other ways, such as their friendship with the elves. Sometimes, as in the case of the Tooks of the Great Smeals of the Brandybucks of Brandy Hall, many generations of relatives lived in comparative peace together in the ancestral and many-tunneled mansion. All hobbits were, in any case, clannish, and reckoned up their relationship with great care. They drew long and elaborate family trees with innumerable branches. In dealing with hobbits, it is important to remember who is related to whom and in what degree. It would be impossible in this book to set out a family tree that included even the most important members of the most important families at the time which these tales tell of. The genealogical trees at the end of the Red Book of Westmarch are a small book in themselves, and all but hobbits would find them exceedingly dull. Hobbits delighted in such things. If they were accurate, they liked to have books filled with things that they already knew, set out fair and square with no contradictions. 2. Concerning pipeweed. There is another thing about the hobbits of old that must be mentioned, an astonishing habit. They imbibed or inhaled, through pipes of clay or wood, the smoke of the burning leaves of a herb, which they called pipeweed or leaf, a variety probably of nicotiana. A great deal of mystery surrounding the origin of this peculiar custom of art, as the hobbits preferred to call it. All that could be discovered about it in antiquity was put together by Meriadoc Brandybuck, later Master of Buckland, and since he and the tobacco of the South Farthing play a part in the history that follows. His remarks in the introduction to his Horbler of the Shire may be quoted. This, he says, is one art that we can certainly claim to be our own invention. When hobbits first began to smoke is not known. All the legends and family histories take it for granted. For ages, folk in the Shire smoked various herbs, some fouler, some sweeter, but all accounts agree that Tobold Hornblower of Longbottom in the South Farthing first grew the true pipeweed in his gardens, in the days of Isengrim II, about the year 1070 of Shire reckoning. The best homegrown still comes from that district, especially the varieties now known as Longbottom Leaf, Old Toby, and Southern Star. How old Toby came by the plant is not recorded, for his dying day he would not tell. He knew much about herbs, but he was no traveler. It is said that in his youth he went often to Bree, though he certainly never went further from the Shire than that. It is thus quite possible that he learned of this plant in Bree, where now, at any rate, it grows well on the earth on the south slopes of the hill. The Bree hobbits claim to have been the first actual smokers of the pipeweed. They claim, of course, to have done everything the people of the Shire, whom they refer to as colonists, but in this case of their claim is, I think, likely to be true. And certainly it was from Bree that the art of smoking, the genuine weed, spread in the recent centuries among dwarves and such other folk, rangers, wizards, or wanderers, as still passed to and fro through that ancient road meeting. The home and center of the art is thus to be found in the old inn of Bree, the Prancing Pony, and that has been kept by the family of the Butterbur from time beyond record. All the same, observations that I have made on my own many journeys south have convinced me that the weed itself is not native to our part of the world, but came northward from the lower Anduin, whither it was, I suspect, originally brought over the sea by the men of Westerness. It grows abundantly in Gondor, and there is richer and larger than in the north, where it was never found wild, and flourishes only in warm shelter places like Longbottom. The men of Gondor call it sweet Galenus, and esteem it only for the fragrance of its flowers. From that land it must have been carried up in the Greenway during the long centuries between the coming of Endinel and our own days. But even the Dunedain of Gondor allows us this credit. Hobbits first put it into pipes. Not even the wizards first thought of that before we did. Though one wizard thought I knew took up the art long ago, and became as skillful in it as all the other things that he put his mind to. 3. Of the ordering of the Shire. The Shire was divided into 4 quarters, the farthings already referred to, north, south, east, and west, and these again each into number of folklands, which still bore the names of some kind of old leading families, although by the time of this history these names were no longer found, only in the proper folklands. Nearly all Tooks still lived in the Tookland, and that was not true of many other families, such as the Bagganese or the Boffins. Outside of the farthings were the east and the west marches, the Buckland, 108, and the West March added to the Shire in SR 1462. The Shire at this time had hardly any government. Families for the most part managed their own affairs. Growing food and eating it occupied most of their time. In other matters they were, as a rule, generous and not greedy, but contented and moderate, so that estates, farms, workshops, and small trades tended to remain unchanged for generations. Let me fix my hair. Hold on. Like, oh God. Look at me, bro. Okay. There remained, of course, the ancient tradition concerning the High King at Fornost, or Norbury as they called it, away north of the Shire. But there had been no king for nearly 1,000 years, and even the ruins of kings, Norbury, were covered with grass. Yet the hobbits still said of wild folk and wicked things, such as trolls, that had not heard of the king. for they attributed to the king of old all their essential laws, and usually they kept the laws of free will because they were the rules, as they said, both ancient and just. It is true that the Took family had long been preeminent, for the office of Thane had passed to them from the Old Bucks some centuries before, and the chief Took had borne that title ever since. The Thane was the master of the Shire. Let me fix my shit. Where was I? The Thane was the master of the Shire Moot and the captain of the Shire Muster and the Hobbitry in terms. But as muster and moot were only held in times of emergency, which no longer occurred, the Thanemanship had ceased to be more than a nominally dignity. The Took family was still, indeed, accorded a special respect, for it remained both numerous and exceedingly wealthy, and was liable to produce in every generation strong characters of peculiar habits and even adventurous temperament. The later qualities, however, were now rather tolerated in the rich than generally approved. The custom endured none the less of referring to the head of the family as the Took, and of adding to his name, if required, a number such as Isengrim II, for instance. Alrighty, that looks like 30 minutes is up. I'm at page 19 of the prologue. God, I was just in the book, in the story. It started off talking about the hobbits and who they are as a people and their history, and where they live and what they smoke out of and what that leaf is, that weed. It feels very vivid and magical. I love it. So yeah, page 19 of the Fellowship of the King. I'll put this kind of bookmark here. Right there. And boom. Alrighty, see you guys in day 44. Let's go. I love this book.